There are some books that are frightening because the story is written inside of them. And then we have books that are frightening because the people who own them. And then, like today, there are books that are unsettling because the knowledge contained between their pages was once considered dangerous, forbidden, or simply something that people were not supposed to know. Today, we are going to look at three real historical books that belong somewhere in that strange territory between religion, magic, superstition, fear, and the desire to understand things that people believe were beyond the normal human world. These are not fictional cursed books from horror movies. And I'm not going to tell you that someone, opened them and then suddenly they invited the devil in their bedroom because that would make a great horror story. But it's not the greatest history for this episode. And instead, these are real works connected to real historical traditions. And in some cases, we can still see surviving manuscripts or early printed copies still with us today. So, if you're sitting comfortably, perhaps with a cup of coffee or tea beside you, let us turn the pages very carefully because these three books were never really intended to be your normal bedtime reading. Welcome back, guys, to the Storytelling Podcast, your cozy corner of captivating tales. I'm your host, Alejandra, and today we are opening three more historical books that people once associated with dangerous knowledge and forbidden practices, witchcraft, spirits, and the supernatural. And as we explore three strange volumes that shows us how frightened people would become, but they eventually had this kind of knowledge that wasn't only for human beings. And just to remind you that this channel is made for you to binge. Many more episodes are waiting for you here on the channel. If you prefer a visual experience, you can also find the episodes on YouTube, where you can watch and listen at the same time. Now, before we open the first book, there is something worth remembering about the medieval and the early modern worlds, because when we look back from the 21st century, it can be very tempting to imagine that people in the past simply believed in everything they were told to. But the reality was much more complicated because people actually argue about magic, religion, superstition, medicine, astrology, demons, angels, and the limits of human knowledge just as intensely as people argue about almost everything today. There were people who believed that magic was completely real and people who believed that certain magical practices were dangerous but possible. Others believed that magic was simply superstition, and the religious authorities who tried to distinguish between acceptable religious practices and practices they considered demonic or forbidden. And sometimes the difference between a religious ritual and an occult ritual would become surprisingly complicated. A prayer might ask an angel for assistance, while a magical ritual might attempt to command or summon an angel. And for medieval religious authorities, that difference mattered. And that brings us to our first book. Imagine that you are a medieval scholar and someone tells you that there is a book that contains rituals through which you can obtain knowledge from angels and spirits, perform supernatural operations, gain visions, and approach mysteries that ordinary human beings are not supposed to understand. Would you read it? Perhaps you would be just a little bit curious, or you could be terrified. But maybe if you were a medieval magician, you would be absolutely fascinated. The book we are talking about is known as the Sworn Book of Honorius, or Liber Luratus Honori. It is one of the most fascinating examples of medieval ritual magic. The exact history of the text is complicated, and that complication is part of what makes it so interesting. Because if it was easy, too easy, right? And the work presents itself as being created by a figure named Honorius, supposedly after a gathering of magical experts. And it claims a very impressive origin story involving numerous masters and religious authorities. But historians do not simply accept that story as a literal historical fact. Instead, what we have is a magical text that circulated in manuscript form, with surviving manuscripts from the late medieval and early modern periods. And one particular interest surviving copy is now held in the British Library. The British Library, and save this info, catalogs Royal MS 17A and in Roman numbers 62 as the sworn book of Honorius or Liber Iuratus Honori, dating the manuscript from the 15th century and identifying its origin as England. But when you look at what is actually contained on the manuscript, it becomes very clear that this is not a normal religious book. The manuscript contains the sworn book is a treatise of suffumigations, lists of angels and spirits, a rite involving exorcism and material connected with magical seals. There are also drawings of angels and spirits in the manuscript. So, when we call this a book of magic, we are not relying on a modern internet description of some mysterious old book. We have an actual surviving medieval manuscript, catalogued by one of the world's major research libraries, and we know that its contents include magical material dealing with spirits, angels, ritual, and supernatural knowledge. And there is even something more fascinating about how the book presents itself. The text is concerned with obtaining knowledge and supernatural assistance, but it also has a strong sense that this knowledge is dangerous and should be treated seriously. The idea of secret knowledge was extremely powerful in medieval magical traditions. The magician was not simply someone looking for a little entertainment. The magician was attempting to cross boundaries. The person performing a ritual might believe that they were communicating with beings that were not human, and seeking knowledge that could not be normally obtained. It could influence the invisible world. This was tempting. And that is precisely the sort of thing that would make this book frightening. But one of the fun things about this book, if we can say it, and if you are a Harry Potter fan, you will know what I'm talking about, is that actually people believe that the pages would bite you. But because the knowledge inside was so considerable, capable of leading someone into practice, this book was considered spiritually dangerous. And there is this awful, wonderful, actually, eerie detail about the British Library manuscript. The manuscript contains illustrations of angels and spirits, and the book actually contained accumulated magical material after the main text had been copied. So basically this is not a manuscript that was left untouched on the shelf. No, it was part of the tradition that people actually wrote, copied, added, and used the magical knowledge. And this brings us to something important because this book does not prove that medieval people can actually summon angels or command spirits. How many books and movies we have. It proves something different. It proves that historically, people wrote books explaining how things were supposed to be done, and then they were preserved and transmitted, and someone would grab it, copied it, added more informations, added their experience if they went through that spell or not. And it was like a group effort. And this first book leads us to that sometimes the fear surrounding a book, it does not come from the book itself, but what people actually believe it can do. And this brings us to our second book. Have you ever heard the expression hammer of the witches? Because this is the book behind it. In Latin, the title of this book is Malleus Maleficarum, and usually translated as the Hammer of Witches. And it was written in the late 15th century by the German Dominican Inquisitor Heinrich Kramer, traditionally associated with another Dominican, Jacob Sprenger. The book was first published around 1486, 1487, and it became one of the most notorious works ever produced on witchcraft. But before we continue, we need to clear up one very common misunderstanding among many of what I'm going to tell you about. The Malleus Maleficarum was not a magical book that taught people how to become witches. It is exactly the opposite. It was a work that attempted to explain witchcraft and describes what the author believed, and I'm going to underline this believed, witches did, and provide arguments and procedures for dealing with people accused of witchcraft. And this, for me, it's much more disturbing than having to summon a demon. Because a book about imaginary monsters can frighten you for an evening, this book persuades real people that monsters are living among them and can have much more consequences. Heinrich Kramer was not simply a writer in writing in a library, inventing stories. He was a Dominican friar and inquisitor who had already been involved in witchcraft investigations, and his experiences contributed to his increasingly intense beliefs about witchcraft. In one particular important episode, maybe this will be a new episode in the future, Kramer attempted to prosecute alleged witches in Innsbruck in the 1480s, and his methods were challenged by the local bishop, who eventually stopped his proceedings and expelled him from the area. Now imagine that. After this failure, Kramer produced his great work on witchcraft, and the Malleus Maleficarum attempted to systematize the subject. It discussed whether witches existed, how witchcraft supposedly work, how witches supposedly interact with demons, and how accusations would be investigated and how what punishments could be imposed. It is difficult for a modern reader to understand how frightening that could become because we can separate today a book from the authority or the state. And, you know, a book can make an argument and we can disagree with it. We are free to do that. But in the 15th century, books dealing with theology, law, medicine, religion, and witchcraft would become part of the larger intellectual and legal systems. And Kramer wanted his work to have authority. And mind you, this was the same person that tried to do a lot of bad things in a city and was banished from that city. One of the strangest aspects of the history of Malleus Maleficarum is that it's a relationship with official church authority, which much complicated than the popular stories after suggest. The book included the papal bull Summis, Desiderantes Affectivus, issued by Pope Innocent VIII in 1484. The bull did acknowledge concerns about witchcraft and gave Kramer and his associate authority in certain areas. But that does not mean that the Pope personally wrote the Malleus Maleficarum. And it does not mean also that the entire Catholic Church endorsed every claim made in the book. In fact, Kramer had problems obtaining the approval he wanted from theologians and the University of Cologne, and the faculty condemned aspects of his work. That is important because the popular version of this story is much more simpler than the real one. Because people sometimes say that Malleus Maleficarum was officially approved by the church and became the handbook used for every inquisitor across Europe. That is not the truth. The reality is actually much more interesting because Kramer produced a controversial work and he gained a significant readership, and it was repeatedly printed and the ideas circulated. It wasn't just, church approved and that's it. I'm not removing any, I'm not putting anything under the rug, but sometimes we need to also know the truth. And the book became so influential because people started to read, and it was putting much more than their religion on the side. And the content is disturbing, as we know how it ended. And the Malleus treats witchcraft as a very serious form of heresy and presents elaborate claims about the activities of witches and demons. And it also places considerable emphasis on women, of course, as supposed participants in witchcraft. And when I say of course, I'm being sarcastic, okay? And reflects the deeply misogynistic ideas that are present in the work. The book's influence should not be exaggerated into the claim that it single handedly caused European witch hunts. It's not what I'm saying. But when the witch trials started, they continued for many different reasons and involved local courts, religious authorities, political circumstances, social tensions, and many other factors, like Malleus. And it will also be wrong for us to interpret that the book was insignificant. It became one of the most famous demonological works of its period, and it was printed in numerous editions over the following centuries. And this is kind of a frightening book for me, because the Sworn Book of Honorius was frightening because it represented the forbidden natural knowledge. But the Malleus Maleficarum was frightening because it attempted to turn fear of witchcraft into a system of belief. And with that, it brings us to our third book. And then we have the third book, which sounds mysterious because its name is called Picatrix. You know, this name almost itself is like it belongs to a magical library, a very dark library. And the history behind it, it's much more complicated but so fascinating. This work, known in medieval Europe as Picatrix, comes from an Arabic text known as, and I'm sorry for my Arabic, Gayat al-Hakim, which can be translated roughly as the aim of the sage or the goal of the wise. According to the Library of Congress, the work was composed in Arabic in Islamic Spain sometime between the middle of the 11th century. Later, around the 13th century, it was translated into Latin and it became known in the medieval Europe as the Picatrix. It looks like a Pokemon, yeah. This means that we are dealing with this fascinating journey of knowledge. The work began in the Arabic speaking world, was translated in Latin, and then entered the European intellect with magical traditions. And what did this strange book contain? It contained astrology, magic, mystical, occult knowledge, alchemy, and ideas about magical objects and talismans. In other words, it did not treat astrology as magic, as completely separate subjects. It was all magic. But also, it presented the universe and its movements and positions of heavenly bodies, and they could be connected with earthly forces. So the stars and planets were not, the distant lights in the sky. They could be understood as part of system that influences that knowledgeable person that might attempt to understand. And, your magical practice, you could use them with that. When we say, oh, we are going through a bad period, this is Mercury in retrograde or something like that, it comes from Picatrix. Now, this is a fun fact, right? And this is a very kind of supernatural thinking from the Malleus Maleficarum. Malleus was obsessed with witches and demons. The Picatrix belongs to a different intellectual tradition, one that connects astrology, cosmology, and magic, and the creation of talismans. And for me, this is a little bit of fascinating because if you open it and expected, a simple medieval spell book that you could find something more complicated, like I'm going to mix this bit of water with something, and I'm going to have a talisman. No, that's not what I'm talking here. The underlying idea is that the universe has hidden relationships. If you understand those relationships, you might be able to create an object or perform an action at a particular time under particular astrology conditions in order to produce the desired effect. And I know, depending on where you are hearing me, how many times have you heard from your grandmothers or your great grandmas or even your mothers? Like, just cut your hair where when the sun is crescent or decrescent, or do not do this when there is a moon in. How many times? Well, what if I tell you that all of those things, including the Mercury retrogrades, etc., comes from Picatrix because it stayed. It actually stayed with people. Those little bits of knowledge stay with people. And it's not just, it's not because everyone was a society of magicians, but because we had arguments and disagreements and religious condemnation and intellectual curiosity. And these are three different books, three different ideas. We have the Sworn Book of Honorius that wants to preserve the tradition of ritual magic. Then we have the Malleus Maleficarum, for me, the most horrible book ever, that it was preserved and systematized this deeply disturbing theory of witchcraft. And then we have the Picatrix, which was preserved in this extraordinary tradition of astrology and magic that traveled across languages, cultures, and centuries. And these three are reminders that the past was not as simple as we sometimes imagine. And the next time that you walk into an old library and see a row of ancient books sitting quietly behind the glass, maybe it's worth to take a second look, because somewhere among those pages there may be a book that once terrified its readers. And it's not about ghosts, it's about maybe some forbidden knowledge. And there are maybe others that believe contain knowledge could never should be written down. And perhaps somewhere in that library there is another strange book that we have not discovered yet. And I love books. That's why I brought these three more books to, be a buddy for the other episode that I'm going to leave the link down below. And this was today's episode, guys. I hope you liked it. And comment below and share your thoughts. Have you ever seen these actual manuscripts on the museums, or do you know anything more that you would like us to know here in the community? And I thought that we have so many views and comments on the episode about the other books, the forbidden books, that I thought about these three. And of course, I needed to talk about them. And I will talk about more books because I'm a bookworm. What can I do? And just to remind you that this channel is made for you to binge, and many more episodes are waiting for you here at the channel. And if you prefer a visual experience, you can also find the episodes on YouTube, where you can watch and listen at the same time. And thank you for listening, guys. And I do have a lot of stories and emails that you guys have sent it to me. A couple of them in different languages, but I'm going to try to make them into English. But thank you for, and I'm going to organize all of them into, series as I normally do. But if you want to share your stories or special topics to be shared in the next episodes, please send them to the Storytelling Podcast 8080 at gmail.com, or follow me on social media at the Storytelling Podcast Official. But before you go, if you haven't done that already, I would love for you to click on the follow or the subscribe button, and see you on the next episode.